Intelligent people are not targeted because they challenge the established order through force, but because they are able to understand how that order truly functions, and in doing so, reveal its arbitrary and manufactured nature. The system does not tremble before raw power. What it fears is intelligence that can decode. Because when a lucid mind starts to recognize the mechanisms shaping its own awareness, it no longer remains a useful piece on the board. It becomes an anomaly, capable of uncovering a fundamental truth. Every system of control depends on the voluntary ignorance of those who sustain it. This exposes the real anxiety that haunts the hidden corridors of power when confronted with free thinkers. The system follows a simple rule. As long as its mechanisms remain invisible, they remain effective. When people believe they are acting freely and making authentic choices, they are in fact moving within a carefully scripted choreography. And this illusion of freedom is more powerful than any visible chain. When you think you are choosing, you are often obeying without even realizing it.
Yet the intelligent mind carries a disruptive force. It sees beyond the layers of sophistication that mask control. It learns to read the symbols woven into images, public discourse, and the stories circulating through media and communication. It detects patterns most people overlook, not because they are subtle, but because no one ever taught them how to see. And suddenly, the psychological engineering operating behind the scenes becomes clear. This kind of awareness destroys something that can never be rebuilt, the illusion of spontaneity. Once the architecture of control is understood, there is no way back to the comforting unconsciousness of before. Cracks begin to appear, not only in the external structure of power, but within the inner world of the one who sees. And when a mind truly sees, it starts to question. And when it questions, it can no longer obey blindly. The system understands this perfectly. That is why it pours immense resources into preserving this hidden architecture. Not because control is weak in its foundations, but because it relies entirely on people failing to recognize how it works. A society made of lucid minds, able to clearly identify patterns of manipulation, would instantly stop functioning within imposed limits and would force the machine itself to transform.
Schopenhauer had already intuited this when he wrote that genuine understanding belongs to those who can pierce the deceptive appearances that mislead the masses.
True intelligence does not merely register reality as it is, it also dismantles the processes through which illusion is produced and maintained. And that ability turns the thinker into an existential threat to any structure built on falsehood. Which raises an unavoidable question. If most people lived in this state of sharp awareness, recognizing every layer of manipulation as it unfolds, how long could such a system really endure?
The answer is unsettlingly simple. It would either have to reveal its true nature or collapse, because manipulation is not accidental. It is a technology refined over centuries, perfected by generations of specialists in social control. It operates through finely tuned triggers designed to generate predictable patterns of behavior.
Most people pass through these mechanisms without ever realizing they are there, like creatures guided by instincts they do not understand. But a truly intelligent mind picks up on these signals. It recognizes deliberate exaggerations, fallacies designed to steer conclusions, and systematic distortions of information. Through sustained analysis, it begins to notice the fractures in the story, the inconsistencies left unsaid, the facts quietly omitted, the hasty conclusions accepted simply because they come wrapped in authority.
This neutralizing of the triggers becomes devastating for the system because it attacks its most vital instrument, the ability to direct masses without their conscious resistance. Conformity is not something natural. It is the result of careful, methodical shaping. And when that shaping encounters a mind able to examine it in real time, its influence starts to crumble.
Conformity then begins to erode, and the difference between an ordinary person and an intelligent one in this context is simple yet decisive. The first absorbs information passively, weaving it into their beliefs without deep questioning, without probing the layers that hold it in place. The second breaks it apart. They interrogate the intentions behind the message, ask who benefits from a given narrative, and confront it with opposing sources. And this ongoing analytical effort makes manipulation largely ineffective.
When you can see the mechanism while it is at work, it loses its hypnotic force. Like a magic trick, once you know the secret, the performance no longer has the same power to impress. The intelligent person cannot be fooled in the same way as most, because they understand how the illusion itself is constructed. Bonhoeffer, reflecting on the conformity produced by systems of power, observed that critical discernment is precisely what separates a free human being from a domesticated one. To analyze narratives is to stop being a mere consumer of them and to become a lucid observer of one's own condition.
The system's fear of this is unmistakable, because it knows it cannot coexist for long with populations endowed with genuine analytical clarity. A citizen who can dismantle fallacies in real time will not obey simply because an order comes from authority. They will ask for evidence, demand coherent reasoning, and require solid.
This does not mean intelligent people are immune to all forms of manipulation. It means manipulation must reach a far higher level of sophistication to work on them. And the more sophisticated it has to be, the less scalable and stable control becomes. A system built on simple messages aimed at billions of passive minds cannot easily adapt to billions of minds that actively analyze, because the engineering of conformity depends on standardization, while intelligence, by its very nature, tends to break free from patterns.
At the core of every structure of control lies one assumption: predictability. If you can anticipate how people will behave, you can plan ahead, foresee resistance, and neutralize it before it even takes shape. The system operates through formulas, expected behaviors, standardized reactions, and indicators of compliance, meant to ensure that the population stays within prescribed limits. Intelligence, by contrast, is unpredictable. It does not follow formulas, and it knows that every formula reduces a reality far more complex than any model can capture. The intelligent mind forges paths that escape traditional systems of surveillance. It learns how to move through rigid frameworks without triggering the alarms of conformity. And more troubling for the system, it imagines alternatives to established orders, exploring possibilities that were never classified as acceptable.
This is what makes the intelligent person fundamentally ungovernable by conventional means.
Because you cannot confine someone within limits their mind has already outgrown, the system naturally favors populations that remain comfortably predictable. It prefers individuals who follow scripts, crave what they have been conditioned to crave, and reject what they have been conditioned to reject, so that everything stays orderly, measurable, and easy to control.
But the presence of autonomous minds throws grit into this machinery. The moment a person begins to think for themselves, their behavior can no longer be reduced to neat equations. They may choose an unexpected path, challenge values treated as untouchable, search for information beyond approved channels, and arrive at conclusions that contradict official directions. Each act of mental independence then becomes an act of resistance, even when it is not lived as such.
The system understands this perfectly. That is why it pours immense resources into limiting autonomy through education, media, and cultural structures. It teaches that thinking for yourself is dangerous, arrogant, even irresponsible. It constantly pushes people to align with the collective vision, to defer to experts, and to trust established mechanisms. Autonomy is framed as selfishness,
Independent thought is portrayed as a lack of social responsibility.
Yet truly intelligent people see through this narrative. They understand that mental autonomy is not selfishness, but the responsibility to fully exercise one's cognitive capacity, and that blindly trusting any authority, whoever it may be, means abandoning what defines us as human, the ability to reflect. They know they cannot surrender this freedom without betraying themselves, because intellectual freedom is the exact opposite of the illusory freedom the system offers.
What the system truly provides is only a freedom of choice locked inside predefined boundaries. The freedom to choose between brands of the same product. The freedom to select between narratives that all lead to the same conclusion. True mental autonomy, by contrast, is the freedom to question those boundaries themselves, the freedom to imagine realities that were never planned. And this is something the system cannot tolerate for long without beginning to fracture.
Any power whose legitimacy rests on a story faces an existential threat the moment that story is subjected to critical examination. Because the system does not survive on truth, but on the appearance of coherence. It needs its narrative to feel meaningful, not necessarily to be true.
The intelligent mind, therefore, holds a devastating capacity, the ability to see where the story breaks down, where facts no longer fit together logically, where deep contradictions hide behind the justification of a given order. These discoveries are not mere academic games. They erode the system's legitimacy in the eyes of those who are able to see.
Nietzsche had already observed that every structure of power rests on systematic falsehoods elevated to the status of truth through repetition and authority. And true intelligence knows exactly how to detect where those falsehoods operate. It sees how talk of freedom coexists with structures that suppress it, how narratives of equality live beside rigid hierarchies, how appeals to security walk hand in hand with permanent insecurity.
These contradictions are not accidents. They are built into every system of control, because no power can be fully transparent without ceasing to be power. While most people accept these stories without examination, trained not to notice, the intelligent person feels the dissonance. They sense that something does not add up between what is said and what is done. And the moment they begin to explore that gap, they discover an abyss. Because every lie supports another, and questioning spreads. What once seemed solid begins to crumble under careful analysis.
Exposing these contradictions becomes one of the most dangerous forms of resistance, not because it demands force or violence, but because it requires only clarity of thought. The one who can articulate the system's internal fractures allows others to see them too. And once a crack appears in a structure that promised coherence, the relationship to that structure changes entirely. Power loses its aura of self-evidence.
Traditional power fears criticism because it knows it is vulnerable.
And what it fears most are those critiques that succeed in exposing its inner contradictions, because it cannot attack their logic without damaging its own legitimacy. To deny these contradictions would be to admit that those who reveal them see more clearly than those who prefer to ignore them. That is where its true fragility lies. It cannot endure serious scrutiny. Its coherence is only superficial. And truly intelligent people are precisely those capable of conducting that scrutiny, of uncovering the fractures, and of showing that a structure promising stability actually runs on permanent instability, cultivated uncertainty, and contradictions that must remain unspoken for the illusion to survive.
The system is not looking for citizens. It is looking for functional units that fit within predefined parameters. That requires a certain kind of human being, one who has internalized their own limits to the point of monitoring themselves,
one who wants to conform because they have been taught that conformity is the expression of.
Intelligent people resist this mold instinctively, not out of arrogance, but because their cognitive sensitivity allows them to feel when they are being pressed into shapes that do not fit them, when they are assigned roles that clash with their nature, when they are asked to deny essential parts of themselves in exchange for acceptance. This resistance often appears as a gut feeling long before it becomes a conscious position.
They cannot accept a role simply because it has been given to them. They question its relevance, examine its hidden assumptions, and refuse to treat as natural limits they clearly recognize as constructed.
Yet the system's image of the ideal citizen is unmistakable, obedient to hierarchy, predictable in response to social cues, submissive to authority, eager to insert themselves into pre-established structures. Someone who does not question because they have learned to trust, who does not analyze because they have been told that analysis is arrogance, who does not seek autonomy because they have absorbed the idea that independence leads to isolation.
In this context, the intelligent person becomes a flaw in the machinery, either because they have developed their intelligence despite constant efforts to contain it, or because their natural lucidity allows them to see through the messages of conformity designed to neutralize mental resistance. They do not fit the mold, because that mold is fundamentally incapable of containing a mind able to reflect critically on its own condition.
And this is where the threat emerges. By refusing to conform, they expose the artificial nature of the mold itself. By their mere existence, they prove that submission is not inevitable, that accepting limiting roles is not the only path, that it is possible to live outside the parameters presented as the only valid ones.
And that proof spreads. Others, seeing someone step outside the mold without the world collapsing, begin to wonder whether they really must conform so rigidly, whether they truly need to deny parts of themselves in order to belong, whether the safety promised by conformity is worth the price of betraying who they are. And it is at that moment that a simple act becomes revolutionary.
That is why the system invests heavily in shaping conformity from early childhood, institutionalizes mechanisms that punish deviation, and builds narratives that present conformity as a personal choice. Because it knows that if enough minds genuinely resisted the mold, the structure that depends on it would fall apart. What every system of control fears most is not isolated resistance, but contagion. When someone who is truly awake manages to pass that understanding on to others, something irreversible begins.
This is not about preaching a message. It is about transmitting the ability to see. Because a lucid mind, one that recognizes the mechanisms shaping its own manipulation, naturally radiates a clarity that cannot be fully contained. It does not need to persuade. It only needs to exist, to speak precisely, to name things as they are. For the moment someone finally puts words on what you have always sensed was wrong, but could never clearly express, mental numbness begins to dissolve.
Schopenhauer already described this contagious nature of genuine wisdom. He observed that clear perception of reality does not spread through force or aggression, but through the quiet presence of someone who sees, like bringing light into a dark room without having to argue with the darkness itself, because darkness vanishes on its own when light appears. When this awakening multiplies, it becomes a cascading process that the system can no longer contain with its usual tools. Because what is being transmitted is not a doctrine that can be attacked or refuted, but a capacity to perceive, an invitation to clarity. And once a person begins to see, returning to comfortable ignorance becomes almost impossible.
What the system truly fears, then, is not the isolated intelligence of a single brilliant individual, but intelligence that communicates. Intelligence that knows how to make visible the structures many people vaguely sense,
but cannot yet articulate. Intelligence that embodies the possibility of thinking freely without being immediately excluded or crushed.
That is why mechanisms of control grow more refined against such figures. They are isolated, discredited, framed as extreme, naive, or irresponsible. Their credibility is patiently eroded within the official narrative. But these attempts to silence them often backfire, because the sheer intensity of repression signals that something essential is being expressed. You do not deploy such energy to suppress trivial ideas. You do it to suffocate those that reach a level of clarity capable of awakening collective awareness.
And when more and more people begin to question, it is collective consciousness itself that starts to transform qualitatively. It stops being a simple collection of disconnected individuals unable to understand one another and becomes an organism capable of recognizing its own condition. And an organism that knows it is being manipulated can no longer be manipulated in the same way.
This cascading awakening threatens the system's deepest stability, not because it implies open violence, but because it marks the end of ignorance. And organized, consented ignorance is the only true foundation of any structure of control. Once that foundation is removed, the system becomes too transparent to survive on consent alone, and would be forced to rely openly on coercion. But a power that must impose itself by force has already lost its essential legitimacy.
The heightened awareness of truly intelligent people does not only transform their personal experience, it changes the very conditions that allow the system to keep operating through invisible mechanisms rooted in collective unconsciousness. The awakening of a few lights the path for many, and crowds that can see can no longer be governed by methods that only thrive in darkness.
Before we part, ask yourself this. Have you noticed which of these mechanisms acts most strongly on your own mind? If this message resonated with you, write it in the comments. Share it with those who may need to wake up from mental anesthesia. Activate the bell and subscribe for more reflections that challenge the official narrative.